The sun hadn't quite cleared the horizon when Arthur Sterling's car pulled up to the curb. In this part of the city, the shadows were still long and blue, stretching across the concrete like tired giants. Arthur didn't look at the sky. He didn't look at the few early morning commuters huddled in their coats at the bus stop. His eyes were fixed on the screen of his tablet, his thumb scrolling through a sea of glowing red and green numbers. To Arthur, the world was a series of calculations. If the numbers stayed green, the day was a success. If they turned red, someone was failing him. He stepped out of the car, the cold morning air biting at his neck. He didn't close his own door. He knew his driver would handle it. He didn't say thank you. He simply walked. That was the rhythm of his life. And as long as the machine kept moving toward the multi-billion-dollar merger scheduled for 10 a.m., Arthur was satisfied. The lobby of Sterling Tech was a cathedral of glass and polished stone. It smelled of expensive floor wax and filtered air. As Arthur strode toward the private elevator bank, his heels clicked sharply against the marble, a sound that usually sent assistants scattering. He liked that sound. It was the sound of authority. Near the elevator stood an old man in a faded navy blue jumpsuit. His name tag read Elias, though Arthur had never once looked at it in the 5 years the man had been cleaning the glass. Elias was currently buffing a smudge off the elevator doors. He moved slowly, his joints stiff from years of labor. The button for the penthouse floor? He stood there, staring at his reflection in the gold-tinted doors, adjusting his silk tie. He didn't acknowledge the man working 2 feet away from him. To Arthur, Elias was just part of the architecture, no different than a pillar or a potted plant. "Big day, Mr. Sterling," Elias said. The voice was low, raspy, and unexpected. Arthur flinched slightly. He looked over his shoulder, his eyebrows knitted in confusion. It was as if the wall had just spoken to him. "Excuse me?" Arthur asked, his tone clipped. "The merger," Elias said, not looking up from his work. He kept circling the cloth against the glass. "Everyone in the building is talking about it. They're worried about their jobs. They're worried about their families. It's a big day for a lot of people." Arthur felt a flicker of irritation. The company is evolving. That's how business works. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a schedule to keep." The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Arthur stepped inside, but before he could press the button for his floor, he saw Elias stop buffing. The old man looked up, and for the first time Arthur saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a tired servant. They were sharp, clear, and filled with a strange kind of pity. "Sometimes when you're looking at the top of the mountain," Elias said softly. Arthur didn't respond. He hit the button, and the doors hissed shut, cutting off the old man's gaze. As the elevator ascended, Arthur checked his watch. 7:15 a.m. He had 3 hours to review the final contracts. He pushed the encounter with the cleaner out of his mind. He had more important things to worry about than the philosophical musings of a man who polished brass for a living. When the elevator reached the top floor, the atmosphere changed. This was the inner sanctum. The carpets were thicker here, the air quieter. This was where the real power lived. Arthur walked toward his massive mahogany double doors, his mind already drifting to the speech he would give to the board. He reached for the handle, his hand closing around the cold metal. Suddenly, a shadow moved in his peripheral vision before Arthur could turn the handle. A hand rough, calloused, and smelling of lemon disinfectant slid over his own. Pinning his hand to the door, Arthur jumped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was Elias. The cleaner had somehow taken the service lift and beaten him there. He was breathing hard, his face pale, but his grip on the door handle was firm. "What do you think you're doing?" Arthur shouted, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "I'll have you fired for this. Get your hands off my door." Elias didn't move. He stood between Arthur and the entrance to his own office, a barrier of blue fabric and worn skin. Elias whispered, his voice trembling but urgent. "I'm not supposed to be here. I know that. But I've spent 30 years being invisible. People talk when they think no one is listening. They say things in front of the help that they'd never say in a boardroom. Arthur stepped back, reaching for the phone in his pocket to call security. "You've lost your mind." "Don't go in there," Elias pleaded, stepping closer. "Not yet. If you walk in that room right now, you're walking into a trap that's been set for months. Your friends aren't waiting for you to sign a merger. They're waiting for you to sign your own confession." He looked at the heavy wooden doors of his office. Beyond them sat his most trusted advisors, men he had known for 20 years. "Why are you telling me this?" Arthur asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Elias looked down at his own hands. "Because my father told me that a man who builds something with his own hands deserves to keep it. And because the people they're planning to hurt, they're people like me. People who don't have a golden parachute." Arthur looked at the door, then back at the cleaner. The silence in the hallway felt heavy, like the air before a storm. The numbers in his head, the green and the red, suddenly didn't seem to matter anymore. For the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling wasn't looking at a spreadsheet. He was looking at a man. Arthur stood paralyzed in the hallway. The gold watch on his wrist felt heavy, ticking away seconds that suddenly felt like hours. He looked at the cleaner's hand, rough, scarred, and steady. For years, Arthur had prided himself on being the smartest man in any room, the one who saw the moves before they were made. But here, in the quiet of his own executive floor, he realized he had been walking blindfolded toward a cliff. A trap? Arthur finally managed to whisper. His voice sounded thin, lacking its usual boom. "That's impossible. My CFO, Robert, has been with me since the beginning. We built this company in a garage. We shared sandwiches over blueprints." Elias, the cleaner, didn't look away. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, the kind that only comes from watching the world from the sidelines for too long. "Greed doesn't care about your memories, Mr. Sterling. It only cares about the next meal. Robert isn't the man you remember from the garage. He's a man who has spent too much time looking at your bank account and not enough time at his own soul." Elias leaned in closer, his voice barely a breath. "They think I'm part of the furniture. I was buffing the vents in the maintenance closet next to your office last night. They were in there late. They weren't talking about growth or synergy. They were talking about the fall. That's what they called it. They've funneled millions into offshore accounts using your digital signature. When you sign those merger papers today, you aren't just merging companies. You are signing a document that admits you were the one who stole the money." Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He thought about the documents sitting on his desk. He had skimmed the 300-page Annex B of the merger agreement. Trusting Robert's word that it was just legal jargon regarding tax jurisdictions? If Elias was right, that annex was his own prison sentence? "Come with me," Elias said. He didn't wait for permission. He turned and walked toward a small, nondescript door labeled maintenance. Arthur hesitated. To enter that room was to step out of his world of luxury and into the hidden veins of the building. He looked at the mahogany office door one last time, then followed the blue jumpsuit, inside the maintenance closet. It was cramped and smelled of bleach and old metal. Buckets were stacked in the corner, and a tangled mess of colorful wires ran along the ceiling. It was hot, vibrating with the hum of the building's massive HVAC system. Elias pointed to a small, rectangular grate near the floor. "Sit," Elias commanded softly, pointing to an upturned plastic crate. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire sat on a milk crate in the dark. He pressed his ear against the cold metal of the vent. At first, there was only the sound of air rushing through the pipes, but then he heard a chair creak, then a laugh. It was Robert. Arthur would know that laugh anywhere. It was the same laugh he'd heard at his own wedding, at his daughter's birthday parties. But today, the laugh sounded jagged, like broken glass. "He's still not here," another voice said. Arthur recognized it immediately. It was the lead negotiator from the rival firm, a man named Mr. Vance. "Is he getting cold feet?" "Arthur." Robert's voice came through the vent, clear and mocking. "No, Arthur is too arrogant for cold feet. He thinks he's the hero of this story. He's probably downstairs practicing his visionary look in the mirror. He has no idea that by noon he'll be the most hated man in the financial world. The police will be at his house, before he even finishes his celebratory lunch. Arthur's heart hammered so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He gripped the edges of the plastic crate until his knuckles turned white. Asterisk. The beauty of it is the signature, Vance said. Arthur could hear the sound of a pen tapping on a glass table. Once he signs the final page, the transfer of the stolen $40 million becomes officially authorized by the CEO. We get the company for half the price because of the scandal. And you get your $20 million consulting fee in the Cayman account. Everyone wins. Except Arthur, Robert added. There was a pause, and Arthur could almost see Robert's smirk. But Arthur has had enough time in the sun. It's time for him to see what the shade looks like. Arthur pulled back from the vent. He felt sick. His stomach churned as if he had swallowed lead. Everything he had worked for every late night, every sacrifice, every mile traveled was being stripped away by the person he trusted most. He looked up at Elias. The old man was standing in the shadows of the closet, his arms crossed, watching Arthur process the destruction of his life. They're going to destroy everything, Arthur whispered. The employees, their pensions, the legacy. It's all a lie, Elias nodded slowly. I've seen men like them before. They think they're the only ones who matter because they wear suits that cost more than my house. They forget that the people who clean the floors see the dirt they leave behind. Arthur stood up, his legs shaking. He felt a sudden, hot flash of rage. He wanted to storm into the office, grab Robert by the collar, and demand an explanation. He wanted to scream. But as he reached for the closet door, Elias stepped in front of him again. Oh, the cleaner said firmly. If you go in there now, they'll know you heard. They'll have a backup plan. They'll call their lawyers and hide the trail. You can't just fight them with your hands, Mr. Sterling. You have to fight them with the one thing they don't think you have. Arthur frowned. What's that? Perspective, Elias said. They think you're the same man you were yesterday. A man who only looks at the numbers. They don't know you're talking to me. They don't know you've seen the basement. Stay here. Let them wait. Let them get nervous. While they wonder where you are, we're going to find the evidence that actually holds up in court. Arthur looked around the small, dirty closet. He looked at his polished shoes, now covered in a fine layer of dust. He realized that for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't the one in control. And strangely, that realization didn't scare him as much as it should have. Why are you helping me, Elias? Arthur asked. I've ignored you for 5 years. I didn't even know your last name until I saw it on that badge, Elias smiled, a small, tired movement of his lips. My last name is Miller, and I'm not helping the CEO of Sterling. Tech, I'm helping a man who finally stopped looking at his reflection and started looking at the world. Besides, he added, picking up a mop, I hate seeing a clean floor get stepped on by dirty boots. Arthur took a deep breath. The air in the closet was thin, but it felt more honest than the air in the boardroom. Okay, Elias. Or, Mr. Miller. What do we do next? The two men, the billionaire and the cleaner, stood together in the small, dark room, not two unlikely allies preparing for a war that was only just beginning. Outside, the sun was fully up now, shining off the glass towers of the city, but inside the maintenance closet, a new kind of light was beginning to flicker. Arthur sat back down on the plastic crate, his expensive suit trousers gathering dust from the floor of the maintenance closet. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He looked at his hands and noticed they were shaking. For decades he had believed he was the master of his universe. But in a single morning, a man with a mop had shown him that his kingdom was built on sand. They have the digital signatures, Arthur whispered. More to himself than to Elias. If I go in there and accuse them, Robert will just point to the logs. He'll show the board and the police that I authorized every single transfer. My word against a mountain of digital evidence. I'm a dead man walking. Elias leaned against a shelf filled with industrial-sized bottles of window cleaner. He didn't look panicked. In fact, he looked calmer than Arthur had ever seen him. The thing about people who think they are the smartest in the room, Elias said, is that they always leave a trail. They just don't think anyone is low enough to look for it. Robert thinks he's deleted his tracks from the main server, but he's a city man. He doesn't understand how this building actually breathes. Arthur looked up. What does that mean? This building was renovated 10 years ago, Elias explained, his voice steady and rhythmic. They put in a new high-speed server farm on the 4th floor, but they didn't rip out the old copper wiring or the old backup drives from the original build. They just layered the new stuff on top. Most of the IT guys are young. They only look at the cloud. But I know a man named Henry. He works the night shift in the basement. He's been here as long as I have. He told me months ago that the old ghost drives still record every bit of data that passes through the building's internal network as a failsafe. Robert doesn't know those drives exist because they aren't on the company's official asset map anymore. A spark of hope flickered in Arthur's eyes. If we can get to those drives, we can find the original timestamps. We can prove that the signatures were inserted into the documents at 2 a.m. when I was asleep at home, not during business hours from my desk. Exactly, Elias nodded. But we have a problem. The 4th floor server room is locked down. Only the executive team and the head of security have access. If you use your key card now, Robert will get an alert on his phone. He'll know you aren't in your office, and he'll know exactly where you are. Arthur paced the tiny room, his mind racing. He was used to solving problems with money or a phone call, but neither of those tools would work here. He had to think like a ghost. How do you get in there to clean? Elias pulled a heavy ring of keys from his belt. They jingled with a metallic, honest sound. I don't use a digital card for the server room. The cleaning crew uses a manual override key because the magnetic locks interfere with the floor buffing machines. But there's a camera right above the door. If the security team sees the CEO entering the server room with a cleaner at 8 a.m. on the day of the biggest merger in history, the alarm will be raised in seconds. Arthur looked at the cleaning cart parked just outside the closet door. He looked at the extra blue jumpsuit hanging on a hook behind Elias. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. It was a plan so ridiculous that it might actually work. Robert and the others didn't see people like Elias. They didn't see the people who emptied the bins or polished the glass. To them, the blue jumpsuit was an invisibility cloak. "Give me the suit," Arthur said. 10 minutes later, the man who was worth billions was unrecognizable. Arthur had pulled the stiff polyester jumpsuit over his white dress shirt. He had tucked his silk tie into his waistband and smeared a bit of gray dust from a shelf onto his forehead to dull the glow of his skin. He felt itchy and uncomfortable, but for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of freedom. "Keep your head down," Elias instructed, handing Arthur a mop and a bucket. "Don't look at the cameras. Don't walk like a man who owns the place. Short steps. Look at the floor. If anyone speaks to you, just grunt and keep moving." Most people won't even finish their sentence before they look away. They stepped out into the hallway. Arthur's heart was drumming a frantic rhythm. As they passed the elevators, the doors opened. Arthur instinctively started to straighten his back, but Elias nudged him hard with his elbow. Arthur slumped his shoulders and began pushing the heavy mop across the carpet. The analysts walked right past him. One of them even stepped on the wet trail Arthur had left, complaining about the mess without even glancing at the man making it. Arthur felt a surge of hot anger, but also a profound realization. He had treated people exactly like this for 20 years. He had been the one stepping on the wet floor. Never seeing the human being holding the mop, they reached the service stairs and climbed down to the 4th floor. The air here was colder, filled with the constant, high-pitched whine of cooling fans. Elias led him to a heavy steel door. He looked up at the security camera, then moved his cart directly underneath it. Using the tall handle and a hanging, the door clicked open. Inside, the server room was a maze of black metal towers and blinking blue lights. Elias pointed to a dusty corner where a smaller, older rack of equipment sat hummed quietly. "That's it? The ghost drives." Arthur dropped to his knees, not caring about his suit anymore. He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, something he always carried for emergencies. He began searching for the interface port. His fingers, usually so confident on a keyboard, were trembling. Come on," he muttered. "Hurry," Elias whispered. watching the door through a small crack. The security rotation happens every 15 minutes. Arthur found the port and plugged in the drive. The screen on the old monitor flickered to life, displaying a scrolling list of file transfers. His eyes scanned the lines of code until they landed on a folder labeled Project Terminus. His breath hitched. He opened the folder and saw the logs. There it was. Digital signature injection. Authorized user. R. Miller, CFO console. Timestamp. 2:14 a.m. It was the smoking gun. Robert hadn't even used his own name. He had used a spoofed admin account, but the internal hardware drive had captured the physical origin of the command. It had come from Robert's home IP address, routed through a private tunnel. "I have it," Arthur breathed, his voice cracking. "I have everything. The accounts, the timestamps, the routing numbers." "Then we need to go," Elias said, his voice urgent. Now, as they stepped back out into the hallway, Arthur felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. He had the truth in his pocket. But as they turned the corner toward the service lift, the main elevators chimed. The doors opened and out stepped the head of security, a large man with a radio clipped to his belt. He stopped, looking directly at the two cleaners. "Hey," the guard called out. "You two. What are you doing on this floor? The fourth floor isn't scheduled for deep clean until Friday." Arthur froze. Elias didn't miss a beat. He hobbled forward, coughing loudly into his hand. "Pipe burst in the ceiling," Officer Elias wheezed, pointing back toward the server room. "Water everywhere? We had to get the wet vacs before the servers fried. You want to go check?" "It's a mess." The guard hesitated. He looked at his radio, then at the two disheveled men. He made a face of pure annoyance. The last thing he wanted to do was deal with a plumbing disaster and soggy carpets. Just get it finished and stay out of the restricted zones. He turned and walked away. Didn't speak until they were back inside the safety of the maintenance closet on the penthouse floor. Arthur stripped off the blue jumpsuit, his skin damp with sweat. He looked at the USB drive in his hand as if it were a diamond. "We did it," Arthur said, looking at Elias. "No," Elias replied softly, checking the clock on the wall. It was 9:15 a.m. The merger meeting was in 45 minutes. "We found the truth. Now you have to decide what to do with it. You can walk in there and fire them, or you can make sure they never hurt anyone ever again." Arthur looked at the door. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He wasn't the man he was 2 hours ago. He was something else now. He was a man who knew what happened in the shadows. "Not just going to fire them, Elias," Arthur said, his voice turning to steel. "I'm going to let them think they won. Right up until the moment the world falls out from under them." Page 242. He paused, his eyes lingering on the words he had rewritten. He looked up at Robert. "You know, Robert, I remember that garage," Arthur said. "I remember when we didn't have enough money for a heater, and we had to wear gloves to type. You were a good man back then." Robert's face hardened. "Times change, Arthur. Don't get sentimental on me now. Just sign the last page," Arthur smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just seen the trap snap shut. He flipped to the final page, the one with the digital trigger. "You're right, Robert," Arthur said. "Times do change." He pressed his gold-nibbed pen to the paper and scribbled his name with a flourish. At the same moment, his computer monitor on the desk, the one Robert couldn't see, flashed a brief notification. "Upload complete. Recipients, Department of Justice, SEC Enforcement." "There," Arthur said, leaning back and tossing the pen onto the desk. "It's done." Robert snatched the folder away. Finally, he breathed. He looked at Vance and gave a sharp, triumphant nod. "We did it," Arthur said, standing up and walking toward the window. He looked down at the street where several black SUVs were just pulling up to the curb, sirens silent but lights flashing. "I did it. You two just signed a confession." The color drained from Robert's face. "What are you talking about?" Arthur turned around, and for the first time, he let the full weight of his authority crash down on the room. I know about the 40 million. I know about the Project Terminus logs. And I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans. Vance stepped forward, his face turning a deep, angry red. You're bluffing. The logs are gone. I saw the white myself. You checked the cloud, Arthur said calmly. You should have checked the basement. This building has a very long memory, Vance, and it has people who see everything, even when you think they're invisible. At that moment, the office door swung open. It wasn't the press. It wasn't the board of directors. It was for federal agents and windbreakers, led by a woman with a badge clipped to her belt. Robert scrambled to grab the folder, but Arthur was faster. He stepped on Robert's hand, pinning it to the desk. Don't bother, Robert. The digital copies were sent 10 seconds ago. The evidence is already being downloaded at the FBI headquarters. As the agents moved in to handcuff Robert and Vance, the room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The two men, who had been the masters of the world just moments ago, were now being led away in shame. Their heads bowed, Arthur stood in the center of the room, alone. He looked at the empty chairs, the cold coffee, and the multi-billion-dollar view. He felt no triumph. He only felt a deep, aching exhaustion. He walked to the door. Elias was still there, standing by his cart. The old man didn't say anything. He just nodded once. Mr. Miller, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, Mr. Sterling? The office is a mess, Arthur said, a small, genuine smile breaking through his fatigue. I think it's time we started cleaning it from the bottom up, starting with the board of directors. The office was quiet now, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet Arthur used to enjoy. It was the heavy, ringing silence that follows a massive explosion. The federal agents had cleared the room, taking Robert and Vance with them. The leather-bound folders were gone, taken as evidence. The mahogany desk, once a symbol of Arthur's absolute power, now just looked like a large, expensive piece of dead wood. He saw the tiny figure of Robert being pushed into the back seat of a car. A man he had called his brother for 20 years was now just a number in a system. Arthur felt a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, not used to being touched, but then he relaxed. He knew it was Elias. The old man was the only person left in the building who didn't want something from him. You did the right thing, sir, Elias said softly. It's a hard thing to tear down your own house to get the rats out, but you did it. Arthur turned around. He looked at Ilias's worn jumpsuit, and then at his own reflection in the glass. He looked like a CEO again, but he didn't feel like one. The house is still standing, Elias, but the foundation is rotten. When the news hits the wires in an hour, the stock will plummet. The board will panic. The thousands of people who work in this building and in our factories across the country are going to wake up to headlines, saying their company is a criminal enterprise. I saved myself, but I might have destroyed them in the process. Elias walked over to the sideboard and picked up a stray cleaning rag. He began to polish a spot on the table where Robert had spilled a drop of coffee. A building is just steel and glass, Mr. Sterling. The company isn't the stock price. It's the people. You spent so long looking at the top floor that you forgot what keeps the building standing. If you want to save the company, you have to start looking at the people who actually do the work. Arthur realized Elias was right. He had been so focused on the merger, the big move, that he had become disconnected from the soul of his own creation. He walked to his desk and picked up the internal phone. He didn't call the PR firm. He didn't call his lawyers, Brenda, Arthur said when his secretary answered. Her voice was shaking. She had clearly seen the police. I need you to open the internal communication channel. I want a live video feed broadcast to every computer, every tablet, and every breakroom TV and every Sterling Tech facility now. 10 minutes later, Arthur stood in front of a camera in his office. He hadn't brushed his hair or changed his wrinkled shirt. He looked tired. He looked human. Across the country, thousands of workers stopped what they were doing. Janitors, engineers, assembly line workers, and middle managers all looked at their screens. They expected a polished corporate statement. They expected lies. And today, I almost lost everything. Not because of a bad market or a competitor, but because I stopped paying attention. I surrounded myself with people who cared more about gold than they did about you. I let greed sit in the chair next to me, and I called it a friend. He spent the next 20 minutes telling the truth. He told them about the betrayal, about the plan to liquidate the company, and about the man in the blue jumpsuit who had saved them all. He didn't use corporate jargon. He talked like a man talking to his neighbors. "The merger is off," Arthur announced. "The people who tried to steal your future are in handcuffs, but we are in trouble. Our reputation will be hit. The road ahead is going to be incredibly difficult. But from this moment on, we are changing how we do things. We aren't going to be a company of executives and laborers. We are going to be a company of people." When he finished, he didn't wait for applause or questions. He turned off the camera and looked at Elias. "I made a promise to the world, Elias. Now I have to keep it." Over the next few months, the cleaning of Sterling Tech became legendary in the business world. Arthur fired the entire board of directors, replaced them not with billionaire investors, but with a mix of veteran employees, community leaders, and even a professor of ethics. He capped executive bonuses and moved his own office from the SEA penthouse down to the 10th floor, right in the middle of the engineering department. But the biggest change was the Elias Miller Initiative. Arthur created a new department called Corporate Integrity. Its job wasn't to look at the books, but to look at the culture. He appointed Elias as the honorary head of the department. One afternoon, a year after that fateful morning, Arthur was walking through the lobby. He wasn't rushing. He stopped at the security desk to ask the guard how his son's baseball game went. He waved at the receptionists. As he reached the elevators, he saw a group of new hires, young, ambitious kids in crisp suits, walking toward the penthouse. They passed an old man in a navy blue jumpsuit who was buffing the brass railing. The young men didn't look at him. They talked over him as if he were a piece of furniture. Arthur stepped into their path, blocking the elevator. "Gentlemen," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm, "you missed something." The new hires looked confused. "Sorry, Mr. Sterling. Did we miss a meeting?" Arthur pointed to the man with the buffing cloth. "You missed Mr. Miller. He's been with this company for 31 years. He knows more about the integrity of this building than any of you will learn in a decade. In this company, we don't look over people. We look at them." The young men looked ashamed. One by one, they turned and nodded to Elias, offering a quiet "Good afternoon, sir." Elias winked at Arthur, a small smile playing on his lips. He went back to his work, his movements slow and steady. Arthur stepped into the elevator, but he didn't press the button for the top floor. He pressed the button for the basement. He had a meeting with the maintenance crew to talk about the new ventilation system they wanted to install. As the doors closed, Arthur looked at his reflection in the gold-tinted metal. He looked older, and he definitely wasn't as rich as he used to be. But for the first time in his life, he liked the man looking back at him. He realized that the cleaner hadn't just saved his company, he had saved his soul. The CEO was no longer just a man in an office. He was a man who knew that the most important warnings usually come from the people you least expect to speak, and that a truly successful life is one where you never have to be afraid of what's on the other side of the door. Arthur stood in the quiet lobby of his company long after the sun had gone down. The building was mostly empty now, save for the security guards and the night cleaning crew. For the first time in his life, Arthur didn't feel like he was rushing toward a deadline. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He stopped at the front desk and looked at a small framed photograph that hadn't been there a year ago. It was a photo of the entire staff, not just the executives, but the drivers, the kitchen staff, and the maintenance team standing together in the parking lot during the company picnic. He realized that the part 6 of his life wasn't about the grand victory in the courtroom or the dramatic arrest of his former friends. It was about the quiet, invisible work of maintaining a home, because that's what the company had become. It was no longer a machine. It was a home. He took the elevator down to the basement. CEOs would never dream of going to the basement at 9 p.m., but Arthur liked it there. It was warm, it smelled of oil and copper, and it was where the real heart of the building beat. He found Elias sitting in a small break room, drinking tea from a thermos. Elias looked older now, his hair a bit thinner, but his eyes were still as sharp as the day he had blocked Arthur's office door. "You're working late, Mr. Sterling," Elias said, pulling out a second plastic chair. "I'm not working, Elias. I'm just thinking," Arthur replied, sitting down. "I was thinking about how many years I spent in this building without ever knowing there was a break room down here. I was thinking about how much I missed because I thought I was too big for the small things." Elias nodded, blowing the steam off his tea. "The small things are what catch you when you fall. The big things are usually what push you." Arthur leaned back against the concrete wall. The trial for Robert and Vance ended today. The lawyers asked me if I wanted to make a final statement to the press. They wanted me to talk about justice and corporate responsibility, but I didn't go. I didn't want to stand in front of those cameras and pretend I was a hero, because you know you weren't, Elias said bluntly. It was the kind of honesty Arthur could only get from him. "Exactly," Arthur said. "I was just a man who got lucky because someone decided to care about me when I didn't deserve it. I've been thinking about what comes next. The company is stable now. The stock is back up. But I don't want to go back to the way it was. I'm thinking of stepping down as CEO." Elias paused with his tea halfway to his lips. "And do what? You aren't the type to sit on a beach and count shells." "No," Arthur smiled. "I want to start a foundation, not one of those big, flashy ones that puts my name on buildings. I want to start a fund that provides legal and financial protection for whistleblowers. For the people in the blue jumpsuits who see something wrong, but are too afraid to speak because they think they'll lose everything. I want to give the invisible people a voice that can't be silenced." Elias looked at Arthur for a long time. Slow, proud smile spread across his weathered face.
That sounds like a man who finally learned how to listen."
Arthur stood up and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, old-fashioned brass key. It was the manual override key to the executive floor, the one Elias had used to save him. He placed it on the table in front of the old cleaner. "I want you to keep this, Elias. Not as a tool for work, but as a reminder. You told me once that I didn't see the ground crumbling beneath my feet. I want you to promise me that if you ever see me getting too high up again, if you ever see me starting to look over people instead of at them, you'll use this key, walk into my office, and tell me to wake up." Elias picked up the key. It looked heavy in his hand. "I think you'll be okay, Arthur. You've started looking at the floor while you walk. That's the best way to keep your balance." Arthur walked out of the basement and back through the lobby. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he didn't call for his driver. He decided to walk. He blended in with the other people on the sidewalk, the late shift workers, the dreamers, and the ordinary people just trying to get home. He was just one person among millions, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel small because of it. He felt like he finally belonged. The CEO had entered his office a year ago thinking he was a king. He walked out of his building today knowing he was a neighbor. And as the city lights twinkled around him, Arthur Sterling knew that the best stories don't end with a signature on a contract. They end with a hand held out to a friend. The days following Arthur's decision to step down as CEO were not filled with the chaos he had expected. Usually when a man of his stature left his post, the market moved like a frightened animal. But this time, it was different. Because he was moving toward a purpose. He spent his final week at the office, not behind his desk, but in the hallways. He visited the loading docks, the mailroom, and the security desk. He shook hands, not the firm, cold handshakes of a businessman, but the warm, lingering handshakes of a man who finally understood that every person in that building was a thread in the same fabric. On his very last day, Arthur didn't have a grand party. He didn't want a cake or a plaque. Instead, he asked for a small gathering in the cafeteria, stood on a low wooden pallet so everyone could see him. He looked out at the sea of faces, people he had ignored for years, and he felt a lump in his throat. "I spent most of my life thinking that success was a destination," Arthur told them, his voice echoing off the plastic trays and metal tables. "I thought if I reached the top floor, I had one. But I was wrong. Success isn't a place. It's the way you treat the people who are walking the path with you. I am leaving this office today, but I am not leaving you. I'm going to spend the rest of my time making sure that the voices of the honest will always be louder than the whispers of the greedy. As he walked out of the building for the final time as its leader, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt light. He walked to a small, quiet office he had rented in a much older part of the city. There were no glass walls here. There were no gold-tinted elevators. It was just a simple room with a few desks and a large window that looked out onto a public park, sitting at the desk. Across from him was a woman who had been a whistleblower at a major bank years ago and had lost everything because of it. She was the first employee of his new foundation.
Ow.
"Where do we start?" she asked, looking at the empty folders on her desk. Arthur looked at the door. Standing there was Elias. He wasn't wearing his blue jumpsuit today. He was wearing a simple, clean gray suit that Arthur had bought for him. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. "We start with the stories," Arthur said. "We start by listening to the people that everyone else is trying to ignore." The foundation grew quickly, not because Arthur poured money into it, but because the world was hungry for integrity. People started coming to the small office in the park. A young nurse who saw a hospital overcharging the poor, a factory worker who knew the water in the local stream was being poisoned, a clerk who saw a politician taking a bribe. They came to Arthur because they knew he had been on the other side. They knew he understood the cost of silence. Arthur found that his life was fuller than it had ever been. He no longer spent his nights looking at stock tickers. He spent them reading testimonies and meeting with families. He spent his weekends walking in the park with Elias, talking about life, not business. One afternoon, Arthur received a letter in the mail. It was from the prison where Robert was serving his sentence. Arthur held the envelope for a long time, his fingers tracing the rough paper. He opened it and found a single page. It wasn't a long letter. It didn't ask for money or a pardon. "Arthur," the letter read, "I hated you for a long time. I thought you were the one who betrayed me. But sitting here in this small cell, I realized that I betrayed myself long before you ever found out. I forgot who I was in that garage. I hope you can forgive me, not because I deserve it, but because you deserve the peace." Arthur put the letter down. He looked out the window at the children playing in the park. He felt a tear track down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He realized that the part 7 of his life was about the hardest thing of all: forgiveness. Not just forgiving Robert, but forgiving himself for the years he spent being blind. He picked up his pen and began to write back. He didn't write as a CEO. He didn't write as a victim. He wrote as a friend. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Arthur and Elias sat on a bench near the pond. The sky was a deep, burning orange, reflecting off the water. "Do you ever miss it?" Elias asked, nodding toward the distant skyline where the Sterling Tech Tower stood tall and shimmering. "The power. The feeling that you could move mountains with a phone call?" Arthur watched a small bird land on the grass nearby. He smiled, a deep and peaceful expression that reached his eyes. "No, Elias, I don't miss moving mountains. I've realized that it's much more rewarding to help someone climb one." Elias chuckled and tapped his cane on the ground. "You've come a long way from that elevator door, Mr. Sterling." "I had a good teacher," Arthur replied. The two men sat in silence, watching the stars begin to poke through the darkening blue of the sky. The CEO and the cleaner. Two men from different worlds who had been brought together by a warning and stayed together because of the truth. They were no longer defined by what they did for a living, but by who they were to each other. The story of the CEO and the cleaner didn't end with a big merger or a pile of money. It ended in a quiet park with two friends watching the world go by, knowing that they had left it a little bit cleaner than they found it. And as the moon rose over the city, Arthur Sterling finally knew what it meant to be a rich man. He had a clear conscience, a loyal friend, and a heart that was finally wide open. The lesson was simple, yet it had taken a lifetime to learn. The most important person in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice or the most expensive suit. It's the one who has the courage to stand up for what is right, even when they think no one is watching. Because someone is always watching, and sometimes that someone is the person who can save your life.